every single person in the company knows where we're headed. Everyone knows that we're aligned in that same direction. When we share that also with a new team member coming on, and they see that we truly live our values and we have a common purpose and everyone's aligned, they're like, I want to jump on board this train. Let's go. And it's been phenomenal in recruiting. I think it's been phenomenal in retention, but it really is living what we said we were going to in the first place with our values.
Organizational values can provide a solid framework for strategic advantage, but only if the leaders are actually willing to use those values while making decisions. I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Andrew Larson, the CEO of Gustav A. Larson Company, one of the top HVAC wholesalers in the United States. While Andrew inherited the company from his father, that wasn't the only thing his father left him. Andrew's father authored the concepts behind what has become the company's values. In this episode, Andrew shares how those values are actively relied upon in day-to-day decision-making and are being embedded into every aspect of the organization. You'll also hear why Andrew calls the pocket card with the values written on it the get-out-of-jail card. Finally, you'll get a chance to hear how the company's values connect to the development of their leaders and why it's important to separate who the employee is from the role the employee plays. To start things off, let's hear a bit more about Andrew's father and the story behind the letter he wrote to the company back in 1970.
Clearly for me, my father was my mentor, someone I looked up to. And so he passed away about 9 years ago. My brother and I run the business today, but he really was someone who was a deep thinker, and our values are really the foundation for our company today. And he wrote a letter to the company in 1970 with regard to all of our values, our company's philosophies and their beliefs. And we've really tried to wrap everything we do with regard to our culture and our values around his philosophies that he shared in that letter in 1970. And so as we look at our Larson values, it really allows us to live today, what he would want us to.
When you think about your time working with him and for him, how would you describe the learning process for you? Was it the type of thing where you sat down and talked about things, or was it a little bit more of things were caught more than taught?
I worked outside our company for almost 10 years before I came back. Thought I wanted to be a doctor and realized that it was really a great opportunity to come back to the family business. And one of his rules was to work outside the business for a minimum of 5 years to learn different management styles, different cultures, make mistakes, but most importantly, come back with something to contribute. And I recall when I came back and would meet with him, he would just listen, and he wasn't very quick to say, I think you should do this. He was always really more about listening and then saying, tell me more. Why are you thinking this way? What was your decision-making process? And really, he was a great question asker. He just wanted to understand my thought process.
It's really amazing, the connection points, because as you articulate what he did, and you think about that simple phrase, which is frankly something that we talk about with our clients all the time. Tell me more about that. What a simple phrase that can just offer so much. And you're describing it to somebody on the other side of it.
My father as well always wanted to make sure that he got across a few different philosophies, kind of like that letter from 1970. One philosophy was you never called our corporate office the headquarters, because to him, the headquarters meant the most important place of a business. And that's wherever we're face-to-face with a customer, not at our corporate office. So that's one example. But he also wanted to make sure we were always focused on being a learning organization. He never liked to use the word training. Training is what you did to someone. Learning is what you had to have inside to really get to that next place and really absorb everything. And so as we thought about our values, and we've named them our Larson values just to have everyone come up with them a little bit easier. The first one is L, and that stands for learning. And we did that because we wanted to be the learning organization that he talked about. But then we talk about kind of three guiding principles after each value. And our three after learning are curious, continuously improves, and personal development. And the first is curious. And to us, to learn, to truly learn, you've got to be curious. And curious to us as well is much more encompassing, because I want to be curious about you and getting to know you. And because this world is about relationships, serving our customers is about relationships. We want to understand how we can be curious about serving the customer better, how we can have a process be simpler and easier so we make it easier for the customer, how we can be curious about helping with our personal development and getting better and helping to shore up our weak areas while we still focus on our strengths. One of my roles is to kind of try and live 5 to 10 years out in the future. And so as an organization, we've got to be curious about what is the future going to be like? How different is it going to be? And how do we make sure that we're changing our company so that we are being stronger and not simply being passed by?
One of the things that I really appreciate as I listen to you describe how, as an organization, you approach this issue of being curious is that you really, in my observation, you really extend it significantly further than what we typically see in business writing. What I mean by that is if we do a search on HBR or anywhere else around curiosity, we'll find a number of articles that are almost all about being intellectually curious. But they don't usually talk about what you just talked about. I mean, the very first thing you said, we need to be curious about you, curious about others, and then you carry that on through even to the customer. Do you guys do anything in particular to help foster that depth of curiosity that you're describing?
I'd love to say there are specific things we're focused on, but I think it's really across the board. And maybe part of it comes back to how we use our values. We do quarterly state of the company meetings. We lead with our values and our mission and our vision. So everyone's aligned in terms of where we're going. Most people say you've got to say things 3 times. We feel you've got to say it 7 to get it across, right? So we talk about our values over and over and over again. We also give all of our employees, I always have one with me, but a wallet card with our values on it. So everyone always has those with them at all times. We kind of call it our get out of jail card. And we say, let the values guide you. Be curious about this issue. Focus on what's right for the customer. Make sure it's a win-win, not a win-lose. But as long as you're making that decision, go ahead. And for some reason, we've got to coach you later on and say, have you thought about this other solution? Well, this is your get out of jail card. You're following our values. So that's one example. Also, we use the EOS process in our business, stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System. And we're trying to get all of our leadership teams throughout the organization down to every level to have what's called a level 10 meeting. They're weekly meetings where we really identify, discuss, and solve problems each and every week. And if we can solve 3 to 6 problems per week in every leadership team across the company, we are moving the ball forward, helping us to be better and serve our customer better. And I mention that because each one of those IDS sessions is what it's called, to identify, again, discuss, and solve those issues, is really about curiosity. Let's be curious about how do we get to the root cause, right? As we're discussing this, let's be curious about what all those different solutions are. And then let's make sure we truly are solving this so we can move on to the next issue.
It's interesting as you talk about EOS, and there are any number of other things that would be similar in the marketplace, where if you boil some of these things down to their core, they are at a certain level attempting with structure to drive assumption out of the process, which is to say to engage in curiosity at every level. But it has to be done, if it's going to be effective, in my opinion, it's got to be done with a heart that is also curious. Kind of going through the motions of EOS or anything else, if I'm not genuinely curious about it, it will not produce as quality of a result. So you're talking about learning as a value of our company, and being curious is essential to that value. And so you're instilling this heart and perspective, and then you lay on top of it the structure of EOS, which gives people an avenue to exercise that. To me, you're essentially combining the who and the what of leadership together to be effective. And it sounds like it's been an effective tool for you over the years.
Very much, because it really is kind of a loop. To be a learning organization, you've got to be curious. And as you're curious, that allows you to learn. And then you become curious about something else. And it's just this constant cycle, which feeds on itself in a really positive way.
We've talked about the values a little bit. Just for everybody's edification here, could you go ahead and list all of them so people can have a broader picture of what the Larson values are.
Yeah, sure. Our Larson values, we've taken liberties with the last couple, but they really kind of spell out Larson. And the first one is learning. We talked about that. The second one is attitude. The third is results. The fourth is service. And then for the O, we use the second letter for collaboration. And for the last one, we used the N for integrity.
I'm going to say something that might sound funny, but I love that you took liberties with the letters at the end. And I'll tell you why. I've always been a little bit suspicious when the key to whatever it is we're talking about just happens to be spelled by whatever it is we're talking about. So we know when all the keys to having a great culture just happen to spell culture, I get a little suspicious. I'm like, really? Did it just happen?
We did try and fit them into Larson, but that wouldn't work. And we're like, these are just too important for collaboration and integrity.
Well, I love that. And as subtle as that might seem, for me, a guy who is passionate about leadership, I actually take a cue from that because maybe foreign concept to you because of how you think, but I run into a lot of organizations who would have been more concerned with its spelling Larson than having it be accurate. So I really love that you took some liberties with it. Attitudes is the second one there. And I know from some previous dialogue you and I have had that you've talked about one of the aspects of attitude being humble, and that's something that's important to you as an organization. Can you talk a little bit more about what humility means to you and how you hope that it shows up in the organization?
Yeah, well, first, the value is attitude, and how we display that are those three, guiding principles. One is to be positive, and then humble, and then friendly. Let me talk about the other ones for a quick sec, too. My father always wanted to make sure that we were friendly. That, again, it goes based on back to that relationship. You're treating someone else as a person, as a human being with dignity. She talked about in his letter from 1970, not simply an object. Positive. We had a board meeting yesterday that I was at, and we went to visit one of our store teams, and we've got, probably 5 new team members. And a few were there that were presenting to our board in terms of what we're focused on. And the leader that was finished presenting said, I hope you noticed one thing. And that was that all these team members, when they were out of the room, had boundless enthusiasm. They were so positive. And I wish we had that in every location. We're not there yet, but it was so wonderful to see and for the board members to see, because that truly is infectious when you get that kind of a culture in a location. And that's our challenge, which is when we have 50 locations, how do we get our culture in each and every location? And that's why talking about our values, hiring, coaching based on them is so important. And we have interview questions that are based on understanding how someone lives our values. And we talk about it in advance because that's how we want them to act and to live. So it's really important. And that last weight that you mentioned was humility. And for us to have the attitude, we want people to be humble. And the reason is that it's not really about us. It's about our customers. It's about our team members. How do we serve them best? How do we put them first? So we kind of know the right person to look for and define, but we then drill down into the questions about values to make sure there really is that fit.
I'm thinking back to something that you said earlier as we were talking about your father, his desire to not call the corporate office headquarters, because it's not about what happens here. It's about what happens with our customers. And the moment that you said that, the word humility popped to mind. And so to me, maybe some folks would say, oh, that's just a little thing. But I actually, as I hear that story, I don't think it's a little thing at all. I think it's an indication of the value of not putting oneself in the center of the universe.
I've not really honestly made that connection, but I think it's maybe just because that's inherent. I know that whenever we have a new team member, I am always making a point to coach about that. In a similar fashion, in our corporate office, there's also a distribution center there. When you're in the office, people sometimes say, let's talk to so-and-so in the back. It's like, no, if anything, that's the front, right? That's who's closer to our customer, getting product to them. If anything, we're in the back. And so there is this constant discussion of our philosophies, and they're little things, but we think they mean a lot.
Sometimes people have questions around character qualities like humility, where they would say, can you actually develop that? Or isn't that just you got it or you don't? What's your perspective on that in terms of what you've seen with your leaders over the years and other folks in the organization around developing greater humility over time.
We kind of use three different criteria when we hire someone, sometimes four when it's maybe more of a leadership position. And that really is looking at the personality profiles, looking at the work experience, having the actual interview process. And that fourth one sometimes is maybe doing a Wonderlic and some kind of an intelligence test as well. But it's amazing how uncannily accurate a lot of those personality profiles are. So we use those as a funnel to make sure that we are right in the very beginning, ensuring that someone, based on their answers, right, has that level of humility. I think sometimes it's, we find someone that maybe in our profile has a high D trait.
High D, we're talking about the DISC assessment?
It could be DISC. We use something called a culture index.
I know people are going to want to hear that, by the way. They're going to like, assessment, please tell me which assessment it is. So that's good.
Yeah, we use the culture index, and it's very similar to DISC. The only difference really is it has a portion of it that really allows you to understand how they think they're doing in their job. And that gets us a little additional coaching for them with that, in addition to simply their base profile. And it's interesting to look at the differences between the two and what that means. But jumping back to your question, I think it oftentimes is hard to shore up someone's weakness, if you will. We like to focus on their strengths. And we like to help really make sure that we can put them in the right seat in the company, and also to make sure they're the right person. So how we use that with EOS, the term is RPRS, which simply stands for right person. And are they in the right seat? Sounds simple, but how we define that is the right person is if they live our values. And then if they're the right seat, do they get it in that position? Do they want it? And do they have the capacity to do that? And so if they're living our values, again, one of our guiding principles is to be humble. So we want them to be part of that. If they're not, we kind of have like a no jerk policy, things like that. It's easy to tell, and someone's not going to make it very far. And in that case, if we were to lose that person, they would not be a regrettable loss because they did not live our values. That's kind of a hard black line, if you will, if someone's not living our values.
It sounds like the clarity around the values would be so significant that somebody who didn't fit that, I'm guessing, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, they stick out pretty quickly and pretty obviously. So can you get to those, we need to make a change here? Do you get to those things fairly quickly in most cases?
Yeah, I think it's been a journey for us. I mean, we've only used and worked with EOS for the past 6 years. And we've obviously had our values for decades before that. But I think this whole concept of right person, or the living our values and right seat, we came upon this 6 years ago. And we have had to, as a result, share over and over again our values that we want to live. But with 450 employees, we can't turn everyone over if they're not meeting our values. And so we've had to go through over the past 6 years and make sure everyone on the team understands this. As you said before, is it part of their base personality, or can we coach them to make sure that they're living these values? And if they can't, then they would be dehired. We'd release them to find their happiness elsewhere. I think Disney said that. But we, as an example, in our Western region, just last year, we had a conversation with one of our managers saying, we only have one person who's not the right person, lives our values, but not in the right seat. Everyone else is an RPRS, which is phenomenal. It's like, wow. And so we've had a lot of hard work to get to that place. We've had to be proactive in terms of coaching teammates and team members. And if they're not right, coaching them out, if you will.
One of the things that I really, really love about that, as you describe it, is that it draws a distinction between the right person and the right seat. Because I could easily see in an organization, if somebody is not performing so well because they're in the wrong seat, it would be easy for many to say, we're going to have to help them move on to the next place. But by separating those two ideas, one is, do they live out the Larson values? Do they align with our culture? It creates, I would think, a much more sophisticated evaluation process to say, hold on. They are the right person. Let's see if we can find the right seat for them. But I love the separation. I'm just imagining the conversations that would create internally when you're looking at if somebody isn't performing so well.
Yesterday at the board meeting, when we had that one manager telling us about those new team members, he used to be a sales manager. He's now moved to the inside sales team to something called a customer experience manager. And with our board, he actually brought up from his coaching, he goes, It was a right seat issue. And I moved, and I'm so much happier in this seat that we found this for me. And everyone knew what that meant. The board knew what that meant, but it came from him as well. And so this wasn't a negative thing. He found a better place where he is thriving in the company as a result. So it's been phenomenal. And he lived the values both ways. So yes, it's worked out super well. And that comes back to our coaching. And, we're very blessed to have our implementer with EOS. His name is Rene Boer. I mentioned his name because he wrote a book, How to Be a Great Boss. And, we always like to say that people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. How do we help have great bosses across the company? We just had a meeting, maybe a month ago with our next 50 level bosses, helping to help them understand how we can be better at coaching, how we can be better at developing our teammates. But it was super important because a big part of that is for our coaching, we have our annual performance review. We've tried to slim it down. They really are focusing on, do they live our values? Do they get it, want it, and have the capacity to do it? And then a personal development plan, if you will. And also, how do they do on their goals for the year? But when we go to quarterly coaching, we don't even take notes. We just meet with each team member, and there's really kind of two basic concepts. So the two questions are really, how is it going, and how can we help you?
I mean, super complex there, Andrew. No, I say that.
It is simple.
I say that jokingly.
Obviously, part of how are you doing gets into how are your rocks doing for that quarter as well. But it really is, how do we support you? How do we clear obstacles? How do we help you be successful? That's what it's really about.
When you think about simple and effective questions like, how are things going and how can we help? Great educations from Harvard and other institutions where you get your MBAs, and there's not a lot of classes, I think, that are sitting down saying, okay, if you just ask these two questions every quarter and have a sincere conversation that's transparent about these two things, it can help you have a very effective organization. And yet that's what I'm hearing from you. And I have no problem believing that contributes in a significant way. One of the things I want to come back to here, and you've mentioned it a number of times, but I want to come back to it because I find it, as you describe it, to be a very rare quality, which is you keep coming back to the values, the values, the values, the values. We use the values. We use them repeatedly. And my experience with many organizations is that they have kind of a process that they'll go through to either adopt or clarify their values, and they'll write them all down, and then they'll put them in a drawer, and then they'll forget about them. and they don't use them. What I hear over and over and over again in our conversation today is that Gustav A. Larson really, really uses their values every single day in a multitude of ways. A, am I hearing that correctly? And B, how did you get there? Because my observation is that's incredibly rare.
We've probably been guilty historically, right? We've had our values that we took from my grandfather Gus, from my father Carl. They've been in every one of our branches. We've, had a session historically to bring them out and to say, here are our values, and they're consistent with the past, so they're awesome, and let's live them. But I think we were guilty of leaving it there, right? And really, in the past 6 years since we've had EOS, we have recognized and realized that, those have been our values. But again, we didn't have all those right people throughout the organization that were living our values. Today, it's very different. We are focused on customer experience. We're focused on creating that win-win relationship with the customer. And because of EOS and maybe learning the value of talking about things 7 times versus 3 and having now state of the company quarterly meetings, every opportunity we get, we talk about our values. And we have seen the benefits. Before EOS, we may have had 10 different initiatives to do. And we got them only all done half well. And EOS has allowed us to really prioritize those to the top ones so we can focus on execution. And I mention that because in EOS, we've got 2 pages of something we call the VTO, which is the Vision Traction Organizer. But the simple point is it allows us to have our mission, our vision, our purpose, our 10-year target, our values, our goals, all on 2 pages that we share at every quarterly meeting, our quarterly state of the company meeting. We share in our newsletters. The simple point is every single person in the company knows where we're headed. Everyone knows that we're aligned in that same direction. When we share that also with a new team member coming on, and they see that we truly live our values and we have a common purpose and everyone's aligned, they're like, I want to jump on board this train. Let's go. And it's been phenomenal in recruiting. I think it's been phenomenal in retention, but it really is living what we said we were going to in the first place with our values.
As you talk about those benefits, and I appreciate the transparency around, as we look back, maybe we didn't leverage the values as much as we could. Are there any specifics that you would dig into and say, because we have improved living by our values very intentionally, is there anything in particular that jumps out at you that you would say that is markedly different because we're doing this better now?
That's a good question. I think that for us, under our value of results, we have been very focused. And real quick, our three guiding principles there are to be self-motivated, right? It's got to come from within. You've got to be inspired from within, to be impactful, and then to be accountable. And similarly, as I mentioned before, if we had 10 initiatives, a decade ago, we were only getting them all half done well. Now we're getting our top 3 done that make the biggest impact in the business, executing on those and driving results. It's a whole different world today. We're having record results, record profits. It's been a phenomenal experience, but it's because of our team members. That's what it all comes back to. And we have had an initiative to drive accountability internally called 100% responsibility, no excuses. And we've been searching to find ways to say, how do we help everyone make sure that they're operating, if we call it in the red, to be positive and optimistic, to initiate things, to have a can-do positive attitude, to listen, to be constructive and collaborative. And we've given everyone kind of a red-black continuum in the company to help make sure they're living in the red and being focused on 100% responsibility. We came across the book Leadership and Self-Deception. And I mention this because we were searching for how can we help our team members be more accountable. And going through our 100% responsibility, no excuses initiative, I think was a little complex. And coming back to leadership and self-deception, it's really come back to be a little more of a simple, elegant initiative. And that really has been when someone is thinking about themselves and that they need to have the self-awareness in that moment, which is very difficult though, but to simply change that narrative and say, how can I help others on my team? How can I help a customer? And that simple flip allows that person to really drive accountability with themselves, with the organization. And it's a much more simple, elegant solution. So we're really very focused on how that helps us on the accountability side and really helps drive our results as well. And I think that's something that today has come about because of EOS, because of our curiosity for learning how we can be more accountable and how we can get better across the company. And that's driving results and performance today for us because of living our values.
Well, it's really inspiring to hear that because it is such a struggle for so many leaders and so many organizations to actually use the values of the organization for decision making. But you're talking about systems for reinforcement, systems that follow up the Larson values that reinforce and enable them. And then when I ask you, what's the difference now versus before, you mention little things like we were getting no initiatives done or 10 initiatives half done previously. Now we're getting our 3 biggest initiatives done on a regular basis. And oh, by the way, the word record profits did not skip past me when you were talking there as well. Important initiatives and ideas are getting completed and we have record profits. That is a pretty good commercial, Andrew, for what it means to really live out your values.
We think they're related. We're really pleased with how the values have really driven results for us.
It's really exciting to hear. It's really educational to hear. It's really impressive to hear because of how rare it is in the marketplace. One way I think it might be good for us to kind of begin to wrap up here is imagine you have new leaders, new potential leaders, new folks coming into the organization, and you see somebody that you would say, this is a high potential person. This is a person that could do some great things here for a really long time. What are a message or two that would be important for you to share with them?
When a new team member comes on like that, number one, we believe that all of them have tremendous potential. And so to us, it really is developing a relationship with that person, making sure that they understand that we have their back. And I think you do that, you build a relationship by creating trust with that person and being real with that person. We have to be vulnerable as a result. We've got to make sure that we are sharing our failures. No one's perfect. How do we continually try new things, which means we're going to make mistakes? So how do we continually make new mistakes? That vulnerability leads to that foundation of trust and that relationship. But obviously, as I mentioned earlier, with the new person, we're going to jump into talk about our values and kind of going into scenarios, if you will, with our customers to say, in this scenario, how would you respond? How do we create that win-win relationship? So those are just a few examples, but we're really very focused on having everyone learn, because we have a very technical industry, learning about what we're doing first before kind of taking action.
As folks may be listening here and they're like, my goodness, I got to go be a part of what Gustav A. Larson is doing. How can people find you, find the organization, find out more?
We can be reached at galarson.com. That's with an O. So, and happy to help people if they have questions for me too. They can reach me directly, andrew.larson@galarson.com.
Andrew, I really love the stories that you're sharing. They are so valuable for all of us to hear and be reminded, and really such an incredible story around the power of using great values in an organization. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about not only the company, but your personal story. And I should say, we've mentioned your father's letter a couple of times here. With your permission, we're going to put a copy of that in the show notes as well, so people can get a chance to see that original letter from 1970 that inspired all of these values. And really appreciate your time and what you're doing by example that we can all learn from. Thanks, Andrew.
Tim, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
There are so many things from my discussion with Andrew that I want to dig further into and talk about, but there's one in particular that really leaps out at me. I mentioned as we talked through it that Gustav A. Larson Company, really unlike almost any other company that I've had a chance to talk with somebody about or be a part of, their application of their values, using their values for day-to-day decision-making is really extraordinary. And you heard, as Andrew talked about, what is it getting for the company? Well, we just happen to be completing our major initiatives and having record profits. That's what they're seeing. But there's a part of the story there that just really leaps out at me. I want to tell the story about Gustav A. Larson Company by sharing a story about baseball. So imagine that you've got two baseball players, and you've got player one who is a capable player, very talented, but not yet fully what he's capable of being. And you've got player two who has the same physical gifts and physical capabilities, but not quite as good of an attitude, not quite as hard of a worker. And so let's say that player one, who is the harder worker with the more positive attitude, let's say that both that player and the second player, they hire a hitting coach to help them get better. And the hitting coach is really knowledgeable, teaches baseball in an engaging way. And he starts to do private lessons separately with each kid. And player one, the really, really hardworking, enthusiastic person, goes away from those lessons and goes home and practices on his own. Player two, who's physically as capable as player one, doesn't have quite as much fire, quite as positive an attitude, not quite as hardworking, does some of the work at home, but not as much as player one. And so they repeat this over time, over the course of a year. You get to the end of that year, and these two baseball players of equal talent, one of them is batting .450, which for those of you that aren't baseball fans, that's a really high average. So clearly I'm talking about youth baseball, not the major leagues here. But one of them's batting .450, and the other one's batting .300. Now, .300 is still a very good batting average, but for you math majors out here, .450 is 50% higher. We can see that. And if I say to anybody listening to this, what's the difference between the two? You're going to say the difference between the two is the attitude and the energy and the effort of player one versus player two. And you would be right. And here's why I share this analogy related to what Andrew shared with us. The hitting coach in this story is equivalent to the application system. In this case, for Gustav A. Larson Company, it's EOS. There's a great system that is at work that can help anybody who utilizes the system get better. But what ultimately was the driver of the 50% better result in our baseball story? It was the core of who that baseball player was. The reason I share that with regard to Gustav A. Larson Company is EOS is an incredibly effective tool that so many people swear by. But one of the things that I heard that makes Gustav A. Larson Company so unique, and that is helping them do things like fulfilling our 3 major initiatives and recording record profits, is they are the equivalent of that first baseball player. When you look at their values, when you look at learning, attitude, results, service, collaboration, integrity, and when you hear Andrew talk about what it looks like when they fully apply being curious, what it looks like to be humble in what they're doing. And oh, by the way, those 2 ideas are not just important cultural ideas, they're very critical to effective leadership. So talking just a little bit more about curious and humble, it's really interesting to note that curious and humble, that's about who people are. And in the midst of developing their culture, I think one of the things that's happening there for Andrew and for the company is that they're not only creating an incredible culture, but they're developing leaders as well, because 3/4 of our effectiveness as leaders comes from who we are, and they're investing heavily in perpetuating these character qualities of being humble and being curious. And you heard through the interview, you heard how that actually ends up manifesting in results and what that looks like, and ultimately how that gets initiatives done and creates profits and retention and all the positive things that we want in organizations. So I think it's really interesting to note where humble and where curious live in the continuum of organizational life. They live in who the individual is. They live in the who of leadership. And so in the midst of building the culture of Gus A. Larson, you also hear somebody that through that culture is developing the qualities that are part and parcel to really effective leadership. And so then they put a system like EOS on top of it. And now this incredible accelerant happens, and it affects their company more significantly than it would other companies who don't show up with values that are as high quality as what they have, or with values that aren't as connected to exceptional leadership as what Gustav A. Larson has. That is my biggest takeaway as we got a chance to visit with Andrew Larson. Is your organization actually living out its values? I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, we'd love for you to share our podcast with a colleague, and if you're up for it, give us a 5-star rating. Thanks for listening.